Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Muris. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everyone, I hope you're having a great summer. I just got back from a week-long hiking trip myself, and so I don't have a new interview for you, but I thought I'd do one of my occasional highlights episodes. I'm going to play you some particularly enjoyable excerpts from episodes past. So in this one, you're going to hear a bit of my episode on the great Catholic sci-fi author Gene Wolfe, a discussion of the movie Ben-Hur with the great Catholic art historian Elizabeth Lev, a clip from my interview with Scott Hahn from a few years ago, another with the wonderful poet Jane Greer, and some of a solo episode about some of my formative experiences with music. As always, I will include the link for the full episode if you want to go listen to that in the show notes. The first clips you're going to hear are from episode 77 of the Catholic Culture Podcast titled Gene Wolfe, Catholic Sci-Fi Legend. And this was a conversation with two different guests, Sandra Miesel, historian and science fiction critic, and Father Brendon Laroche, both big fans of the great, but still not too well known in the mainstream Catholic sci-fi author Gene Wolfe. Here you'll be hearing excerpts from my conversation with Father Brendon Laroche. And in this first clip, you'll hear us talking about the notion of genre fiction and why it is sometimes undervalued by literary critics. I'd like to return for a moment to this idea of genre because it's interesting and I don't know when else I would get a chance to talk about it on the podcast. So tell me if you think I'm right about this. So genre is essentially any kind of what you would call genre fiction. It's literature that a subsection of literature that focuses on a specific subject matter or a style or a series of tropes. So you have detective novels, you have westerns, you have sci-fi, you have fantasy, you have different subsets of those things. I guess horror, what else? I'm not sure, but it's not the same as like comedy versus tragedy. Those aren't genres exactly. So I guess the reason why this might be looked down on by some, other than a lot of genre fiction is not modern realism, and so the kind of people who deny the supernatural or whatever tend to frown on it, is that there's always the danger artistically that people are just going to read it because they like space. It's like, I'm going to see whatever Star Wars movie comes out because I like ATSTs, and it doesn't matter that much how good the movie is because I'm just excited to see an ATST on the screen. So I guess that might be the danger. It's like, I like paintings of big, 18th century French battles, and I'm not really that interested in the composition or anything like that, but just like if I see it, it sets me off. So I guess that's like part of the legitimate sort of like concern towards genre that some people have, or one of the possible pitfalls. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense to reject something simply because it, shares in a certain tradition or uses certain subject matter that happens to be interesting in itself, as well as how it's used in a literary context. Do you think that I'm sort of in the right ballpark there?
I think that's true. I have a friend who says that genre basically boils down to marketing. When you read an author, you might like the author and you might not care. There are authors who cross genres, but like you're writing a story with spaceships, it makes sense to market that story to people who like spaceships. And I've argued the point sometimes that like drawing a distinction, speculative fiction, I think is good. I mean, I would say that science fiction and fantasy are all just fantasy in some respects. I've made the argument that, well, like what's in some ways a big sci-fi genre or subgenre, cyberpunk, right? Where you put your mind in a machine. Well, to a materialist or a Cartesian dualist, that makes perfect sense. That's related to the facts of the world. Yeah, we could do that with technology one day. To an Aristotelian or a Thomist, that's fantasy. It's made up. You're imagining a different metaphysical world. That's not how reality works.
So for people who don't know what cyberpunk is, I guess The Matrix would be a pretty good example of that.
Sure, The Matrix is a great example. Johnny Mnemonic, if you want an older Keanu Reeves movie. If you want books, the works of William Gibson, or especially his earlier works, are very much. And I like cyberpunk a lot. Ghost in a Shell, if you're interested.
I just rewatched the movie last week.
Yeah. And cyberpunk can do a lot of things. There's an interesting part in the beginning of the original Ghost in the Shell movie where you're seeing the Major's body created, and then she wakes up and she looks at her hand, and there's a question of identity and stuff like that that can be very deep. But on the other hand, the idea that like and strictly speaking, the Major is basically a living human brain in an entirely prosthetic
Yes,
body.
yes, yes.
But the kind of thing where these things can go at some points, we're like, oh, well, you've transferred your mind to another body, and it's still you. That kind of very kind of modern Cartesian, the soul and the body are different, or kind of almost verging on materialism, take on like Locke, who thought that personhood was continuity of personality rather than something related to our being, which is certainly what Aristotle would think, what St. Thomas would think, and arguably, not even arguably, there's a dogmatic definition that the soul is the form of the body, is the belief of the church as well. And so like genre, ultimately, I think that my friend is correct that genre is a marketing thing. Like I want to tell a great epic, but I want to tell it in the future. Like Frank Herbert's Dune, this great epic of empires and ecology and what it means to be human versus a machine that can mimic our thinking, which is in the background of these things. He wants to tell that story. He wants to bring in the importance of religion without kind of taking any modern things. So throw it a couple millennia in the future. These things have evolved, but you can still see the parts if you know enough about them. And let's play this out. And Frank Herbert isn't less of an extremely skilled author at dealing with these things because he decided to work with psychics and biotechnology and spaceships. In some ways, one could argue that working within those, here's a very Chestertonian point, constraints are for creativity. Just like Chester talks about the laws of fence, like don't go past this because you'll fall down a cliff. Constraints of genre or of technique and all that are to help with creativity. Cervantes Pinker is the great Dominican moral theologian of the modern age. In his work on virtue, he talks about different kinds of excellence, and freedoms. One of the things he talks about is freedom of excellence is really what virtue is about. If you want to be good at an instrument or a sport, you've got to learn by learning the fundamentals. And these are boring at some points and they constrain you. But once you can work well within those constraints, right, you can play and even create great pieces of music. You can pull off that hat trick or that triple play or whatever. Pick your sport analogy, great thing, the Hail Mary pass. You can do those things because having mastered the skills that are constrained by the rules, you now have a place to move in them in ways that are creative and liberating in many respects. And so the idea that genre is bad is either a failure to see how constraints can aid creativity, or as you said, especially when it comes to science fiction, fantasy, horror, it's like, oh well, those deal with. And people call it escapism, as Tolkien said once in one of his letters, I think. He's like, well, I wouldn't prefer the kind of fiction they prefer. And they should ask themselves, if this literature is escapist, why do you want to escape? Isn't that usually what a prisoner wants, not a free man?
Yeah, arguably in the grand historical scheme of things, realism is genre, right? Because it's just not the norm for human storytelling. Historically, it's a relatively new thing, and this is something I've kind of had hammered into me reading people like Tom Shippey, the great Tolkien scholar, or just in my study of Tolkien because he's the author that I've read most commentary on. That's really come home to me is that realism is kind of an anomaly, and it's not that there's something wrong with Jane Austen. I love Jane Austen, but it's as much of a kind of constraint as anything else, I guess you could say.
Sure. And I think Austen is a great example there because the constraints of her very realist fiction are the constraints not only of the social class of Edwardian England, but also the moral constraints of a Christian, what is still a Christian civilization. And her stories play out with the importance of those things as very real and interacting in the life of her characters. And the way faith plays out in, say, Tolkien or Wolfe, it's not always right there in your face, but yet you can read plenty of Austen scholarship that talks about the importance of that, the importance of her as the daughter of I believe her father was a pastor or whatever in the Church of England, the importance of that playing out in her characters. and having to Pride and Prejudice tells you exactly what it's about ultimately. One of these people has to overcome their pride, the other has to overcome their prejudice, so that they can really see each other for what they are, and their love can be something more than just attraction, or as an other, a fatal attraction that doesn't have a firm founding, like the one sister, or a desire for security that doesn't have any kind of mutuality, as in her one friend, but she gets the good marriage, and it's not the good marriage first and foremost because she married a wealthy man. It's a good marriage because they respect each other and see each other's strong virtues, and have also helped each other overcome their failings to be able to be who they are. I think that's that realism also has its constraints if we want to be true to who human beings are. I'm not sure that modern realism, quote unquote, does all that well, but we can't all be Jane Austen.
In this next clip, I asked Father Brendon to introduce Gene Wolfe's most famous work, The Book of the New Sun. It's set in, the distant future when the Earth's sun is cooling. Society has kind of reverted to maybe a quasi-medieval state, but with remnants of old technology, but the line between magic and technology is kind of blurred. You got some alien stuff going on. I've only read it once, so I can't really be too specific about the nature of it. So, the main character is this guy, Severian, and Wolfe said that he has been born into a very perverse background, which seems accurate. What kind of background is Severian born into, Father Brendon?
Well, Severian, so one of the ways, kind of a remnant, kind of a medieval comeback in the society, certainly in the capital city of Nessus, where Severian grows up, is that there are guilds, and these guilds have quasi-religious things. They have patron saints. The guild, and Severian is born into the Guild of the Seekers of Truth and Penitence, which sounds wonderful, but they're commonly called the torturers because they're basically the headsmen for the empire. And so when somebody needs to be tortured for information or executed, torturers do that. The torturers are the jailers, at least in Nessus, and also in certain parts of the other country where tortured journeymen go out and journey and ply their trade. And so Severian is, just as sometimes monasteries in the Middle Ages would, children and families couldn't support or ever be left there to be educated and raised and become part of the monastery. The torturers get new members by people either leave their children with the torturers, or if a pregnant woman comes in to be tortured and executed, the torturers get the child. Severian, as far as we know, was born of a woman sent to the torturers to be jailed, to be punished, and ultimately executed. And so he's born right into this, and he grows up thinking it's normal to do what they do. And the perversity there really is, and he'll say this at the end of the book when he comes back to Nessus as the ruler. That's kind of the whole book, and he tells you that right in the beginning, so it's not really a spoiler, that this is his story from being a torturer's apprentice to being the autarch, the emperor, the ruler of the Commonwealth. And he comes back, and he says that a lot of people who are poor and hungry will come to torturers and they'll tell, oh, I'm great, I torture rats, I torture dogs, and torturers won't take them. They have to raise them from a child because, as one of the masters says to him at the end of the book, well, bad men can't do this because bad men can't be just. And Severian's answer is, well, yes, master, but I don't think good men should do it. He was like, good men shouldn't do this. And he's like, well, bad men can't do it. And Severian's like, well, that's why I don't think maybe we shouldn't do it at all. That the perversity of it is that for especially the torture aspect of it, certainly, the executioner and the jailer are not our favorite people, but those things in their proper place can be, justified. But the kind of torture that is described, the kind of torture the torturers do is pretty horrendous. And the idea is, well, good men have to do this, and they have to be raised in doing it to be good at it and moral, in the sense that they cannot ever err either to mercy or justice. Their job is to carry out the sentence. And
right, no sadism, no mercy.
Yeah, and if they came in, they might either be too soft on people they like, or they might be the kind of people who just like hurting people. And so the idea is that it has to be good men. And the perversity of it is that it warps good men. It certainly warps Severian. I mean, in all his relationships, in some ways, are especially his relationships with women, are very warped. And I don't think that it's overly psychological to say that Wolfe's part of that is Wolfe saying how this plays out. good men can't do evil things and remain good men untouched by them, and remain doesn't make them necessarily monsters, even though that's how the world views them. But and if they stick to their moral code, but nonetheless their moral code is going to be skewed. Their relationships with people are going to be skewed, and I think that's part of the reason why Severian's relationship with women is so obviously messed up in some ways. That he can't separate love in some ways from physicality and all those things. And part of that is, I think, the perversity of his being raised and the tragedy of it. The torturers by the end of the book are tragic because evil men can't do this, but in the end, what we've learned is that one of the things we've learned is that good men can't either. And that's the tragedy of it, that good men are being made to do that, and they shouldn't. And also, just even in the name, it's good to seek for truth and for penitence. Those are good things. Truth is good. Repentance is good. But what that boils down to is that the guild for the seekers of truth and penitence is the guild of torturers. And so that perverts the desire for truth, the desire for repentance, ultimately the desire for justice, something greater as an ideal rather than just the end of an equation, I think.
So Severian does show mercy to someone, and for that he is kicked out, and he has to go, he becomes a kind of itinerant headsman in various villages that need a criminal to be executed. He does his job, he does it, artistically and with discipline, and he somehow comes into the possession of an ancient relic of a religious figure lost in the mists of time known as the Conciliator, who I think it's pretty clear is supposed to be Jesus, but, in the book, nobody, well, maybe I'm wrong, but in the book, nobody really remembers that much about him. So he comes across this relic, and he just starts inadvertently healing people and things when he brings it near them, and so he's trying to figure that out. And then the next, 3 books, I'm not sure that I can even explain what happens, but he just has sort of various episodic experiences which eventually lead him to a kind of ascent in power and also kind of a moral ascent, I suppose.
His journey is, I think there's shades of Dante there in that he has to journey into darkness to then climb out again.
This next segment features a couple of excerpts from my film podcast, Criteria, the Catholic film podcast. And this was our discussion of the movie Ben-Hur. We were discussing that movie because it's on the Vatican film list, and we had Catholic art historian Elizabeth Lev join us for that episode. I would love to know how they learned the art of chariot driving and building in this day and age. Like who's kept up that craft to teach them how to train the horses properly for team. I guess maybe it's not that different from like a wagon or something. I don't know.
It is. Well, that's the interesting thing about the whole. So the second unit, which is responsible for the chariot race, was led by Andrew Morton, who had worked on the chariot, who had worked on the 1925 version of Ben-Hur. So he already had experience of seeing, kind of trying to make this thing happen. Although they were going to do it. I mean, this is a $15 million movie. In $15 million in 1959. It's a crazy amount of money. And the other person who was involved was a man named Yannick Canute is his name. And Yannick Canute was the other assistant with the second unit. He was the assistant director of the second unit. Yannick Canute is the man who did the stunts. He was the stunt director in the movie Stagecoach.
Yep.
And
that's right, Yannicka Canute. Those
movies, those back when they did those,
I watched the documentary.
Yannicka Canute. Back in the day, they would do these very complicated scenes with teams of horses. So they weren't that far away from using horses. So and then they brought in a great handler of the horses. It was a man named Glenn Randall who came in to do the training. And then this is a scene that took 5 months to film. It took months from the minute that Stephen Boyd and Charlton Heston showed up on set. Wow. They had to start learning. And apparently Charlton Heston did like 3 hours a day of learning and throwing javelins.
Wow.
And
he learned several skills.
There's a funny story where I forget who the name of the person who was training them. Charlton Heston apparently already was very tough, and he had they say very strong shoulder muscles, and he had a lot of calluses on his hands. So he didn't have trouble. He learned very quickly how to manage to do these scenes with the horses. But poor Stephen Boyd, who, obviously had been manscaped to within an inch of his life, he kept ripping his hands apart, and they had to stop filming every now and then to let his hands heal. He had a much harder time with it. So they had to go through this whole training. Then they designed a separate track. So all the while they're building the giant, stadium, they had a second dirt track where they were practicing all the time, and they brought in 82 horses from Yugoslavia. Then, and this trainer just turned them into 9 teams of horses. It's that scene is just, I feel like it's kind of, it's like the Sistine Chapel of cinema. It's just, it's so new.
Yeah.
So completely new, and the things, and you feel it's the same feeling I always get on Lord of the Rings when they were undertaking this project as a team, and they didn't know as they were starting it exactly how some of these things were going to work out, but they all got together as a team. They all went to New Zealand, and you can feel how the team is working together, like how they're so excited about what they're doing. I feel that about I feel that in Monsters Inc. I feel that in The Lord of the Rings, and I feel that in this movie, when you kind of wish you could have been part of that team, because you know that every day, with all of the difficulties, broken cameras, like $100,000 lenses damaged, the potential of death. I mean, the famous stunt of Ben-Hur falling out of the, when he hits he jumps over the
and he
chariot.
flips out of the chariot.
There were only 2 stunts that he didn't do, that Charlton Heston didn't do. And the person who did the stunt of the jumping chariot was the son of Yannicka Knut, Joe.
Wow.
And when Joe did that stunt, he was going too fast because he was 22-year-old and really excited. He was going too fast, and it hit it was a log. To make that jump, there was a little log embedded in the ground, and he was physically, that scene when you see someone physically thrown out of the carriage, that was actually the boy was thrown out of the carriage. He managed to hold on to the horses a la Stagecoach, and then they stopped it immediately, and they took him into the infirmary, and he had a cut on his chin. He got his stitches, and he came right back out and finished. As everybody, apparently, the story is told beautifully by Andrew Martin, and so this was the kind of things they did. Stephen Boyd actually did the scene of being dropped underneath the carriage. The first version, they tried to do it with a dummy, but the dummy looked like it was a dummy. The other guys you see falling out of the carriages, they are dummies, and they kind of look it, right? But the guy who falls under the carriage when it's Stephen Boyd is actually Stephen Boyd. He's protected by harnesses.
Now are you only talking about the close-up shot where he's hanging on but not being trampled, and not the scenes where he's actually being trampled? I'm assuming those are a dummy, but the one where he's hanging. He's hanging,
exactly. He's hanging underneath the chariot. So I mean, this is they're doing things in the world of stunts that haven't really been done.
It's still amazing to see, and also all of the storytelling that's able to be accomplished in the midst of all of it too, right? Because it's not just thrilling, stunts, but there's actually, the drama of the race unfolding and these discrete moments of tension and conflict, and it's like a movie in its own right. It feels like a very complete experience from beginning to end.
Sure.
And frankly,
especially because they take so much time, I think, with introducing the track.
That's
and
right.
Having the horses ride around.
Yeah, everything's delightful. The music, the stadium filled with people, the colors. That every charioteer has their own sort of regalia from their country of origin. It made me think of Star Wars Episode 1, pod racing. I imagine that George Lucas had to have been operating with this movie in mind, because basically what we get in Star Wars Episode 1 is just space chariots doing the exact same thing, down to Anakin's pod racer has the same colors that Ben-Hur has on his chariot.
But even for the making of the Star Wars, the first three, the new numerical system irritates me beyond belief. But even with the making, the movie Ben-Hur is part of what inspired George Lucas, and especially in the use of dramatic music. And also in this kind of very sort of these grand processions, like how to create these very grand scenes, which he does when you see the evil empire coming in. And interestingly though, during the actual race, there is no music. All you hear is we hear the music of the coming in,
right?
But once the race starts, there's no music. All you hear is that the hoofs on the ground, the chariots. It's really, I mean, you're no distractions. You're in that race.
Yeah, the sound design is incredible. The second time we watched it together, Thomas turned down the volume during the chariot race, and I was so annoyed at him. I didn't say anything, but I'm saying it now because the sound design is just incredible. Like the thumping of and then the grinding into the wood and the squeals, like oh my gosh, when people are left on the track and you know that these horses are coming back around, you better hurry and get out of the way. Oh my gosh, I'm getting excited just thinking about it.
It's a myth, correct, that somebody died during the filming of the chariot race?
No, nobody died. That is the amazing thing. No, not even a horse. Not even a horse. When they used to do the father, Yannicka, used to do horse stunts, and he developed a kind of horse stunt in which the horse almost always died. So, I mean, in the space of Stagecoach is 39, and this is 59. So obviously some animal rights had kicked in that period. So not only that, 82 horses came and 82 horses left. Wow. And outside of injuries, nobody died. And Zimbalist, you know the only person who died? The producer. Sam Zimbalist died on set of a heart attack.
Whoa.
The only person, and that William Wyler had to take on the job of being the producer, but he was the only one who was so awful. This movie, Sam Zimbalist, he tells Andrew Martin, you can do whatever you want for this scene. The only thing is nothing under any circumstances can happen to Charlton Heston or Stephen Boyd. So they got all this trouble, and they say everybody lives, and then Sam Zimbalist dies. That makes me and he never got to see it. He never got to see his movie win all those Oscars. I don't know. I was really interested in the photography of it, like the kinds of. I was interested in this new kind of photography and the way they have to use color and light. So they're using these. So I was reading a lot of those, and then from those I would kind of follow another article or follow something else. And I found Andrew Martin's own description of what happened. So I thought that was kind of to hear him talking about it.
Was he the DP?
He's his second unit. He's the guy who does he is the man who did the chariot race. He is the guy. It goes under the heading of William Wyler. William Wyler showed up on the set for the procession scenes and then never came back. It was 100% Andrew Martin who did that scene. That with the help of this Canute. And I just found it really. The stuff I liked is a little nerdy, but it has to do with using these. So there were basically 6 of these 65 millimeter cameras in the world, and 5 of them were in Rome being used by William Wyler, and 3 were given for the chariot scene, and 2 were for other scenes. And the problem with this. Is it's super high definition, and so they had to worry all the time about. That's why they're wearing such thick makeup, because it will bring up anything that's on your face. It'll show, and they also had to be super careful with color contrast, and it also has difficulty focusing. This particular technique has difficulty focusing on 2 people at once. So if you had 2 people and they needed to be equal in the scene, you had to dress the other one in a contrasting color and light them differently. I mean, it's so. I mean, beyond the technical difficulties of getting the horses and building the set and everything else, but the work on the part of those cinematographers to get the light always. They're filming from 6:30 in the morning till 5:30 in the evening, and the light changes all day long, and so they have to constantly be changing the way the light is put on the set and the way the makeup and it's just hats off. It's the beginning of, and I love big, huge, expensive movies. Matter of fact, people ask me, what kind of movies do you like? I say, I like them expensive. I don't like cheap movies. I like movies that look like you have spent so much money on them. And this is the beginning of the expensive movie. And in my opinion, that it shows it. And I'm very pleased that the Vatican put something that's such an Americanata. They usually don't like they don't like our exuberance, where it's like we're adolescents, we get overexcited.
It's the only Hollywood film on the religion section. The next highlight is from episode 80 of the Catholic Culture podcast, Bring Out Your Dead, with Scott Hahn. And in this segment, Scott talks about the church's historical position on cremation. Well, let me ask you this. It's not something people talk about, but am I right in thinking that burying one's dead in consecrated ground is a service to the soul in purgatory, similar to having masses said for them and things like that? That itself is of aid to the soul in purgatory.
Absolutely. And exactly. It is a way of serving God and serving and honoring our loved ones, especially our parents and those elders who have come before us. At the same time, I clarify this emphatically, that if you did cremate your spouse, your parents, or anyone else in a way that was innocent, I'm not here to try to make you feel guilty. What I would do is to say that, some people who practice the sacred burial customs in holy ground might have done so in unbelief or just out of inertia. On the other hand, if you have cremated your loved ones inadvertently and you wake up and realize that was less than ideal, it isn't time to start feeling guilty for that. It's time to make up for lost opportunities, because the prayers on behalf of our loved ones, the suffrages, as well as the sacrifices that we make, and especially having masses said in their memory, this is the stuff, this is supernaturally nuclear in ways that we won't know until we meet up with them again in heaven, and they'll remember the things that we did sort of in passing, and they'll express a gratitude that is probably going to surpass anything we can imagine. And likewise, it will come our turn. And so why not set into motion the restoration of these proper practices for their sake, as well as our own and those who will come after us?
Of course, if you bury their cremated remains in holy ground, that's also a good thing. That's also helpful and of course required. We're not supposed to scatter the ashes or keep them in our living room, on the mantelpiece or any of that stuff. So let's talk, since we've gotten there, let's talk directly.
That thought, though. I want to just emphasize something along those lines, because, as I indicate in the book, the revival of cremation is less than 3 centuries old, truth be told.
That's what I was about to ask about, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, the French revolutionaries, the philosophes, they had contempt for the body, but especially the Christian notion of the resurrection of the body. And so you can see how in the 1790s, cremation was weaponized and used to kind of target not only Catholics who were faithful, but the Catholic faith as well. Because if more is caught than taught by example, then to devangelize the faith that remains in a Catholic culture like France, you weaponize cremation to target the belief in the resurrection. And by the middle of the 1800s, this had spread pretty far and wide, so that by 1717, with the foundation of the Freemasons, this becomes quite emphatic. So that at the Vienna World Expo, I believe it was in 1873, you have this Italian Freemason, Brunetti, who is the inventor of the modern crematorium. And this is put on display at the World Expo in order to convince people to do this. And at one level, you can be utterly pragmatic and argue for, the fact that it's economical, it's more neat and tidy in the end, and all of that. But on the other hand, I think what you have to recognize is that it is effective and subversive of faith. So that, you have the condemnation in 1886 by the magisterium, so that if you do cremate your loved ones, you are excommunicated, because in 1886, the only ones who did were not just non-Catholics, not just ex-Catholics, but anti-Catholics. But, it became so widespread in the first half of the 20th century that by 1963, Pope Paul VI, early in his pontificate, issues this Piem et Constantem, where he permits, but it's only a concession to a widespread cultural practice, but he endorses, he encourages, he approves. He really calls for the rediscovery of the proper sacred burial in holy ground that has always been universal with the Catholic faith. But, with that permission in 1963, you open the door and then suddenly it's a floodgate that is opened. And so by 2013, I think it is 35% of Catholics are cremated in our culture, well over 50%. And it costs anywhere from, $900 to maybe $2,000 or $3,000 for cremation, whereas it's anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 for, the funeral, the embalming, the burial, the casket, and everything else. I think it's time for us as Catholics to get together in parishes and our dioceses and to form confraternities like we had in the Middle Ages to make this affordable for all, so that it's not just one of the corporal works of mercy, along with feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting those in prison, those who are sick. I mean, it really is a way of living family life in the Catholic Church as the family of God that is concretized, that is practical. And I just think that establishing confraternities is one way that dioceses and parishes and even neighborhoods could work together to make this affordable so that everybody who wants to have a burial can afford it. And everyone who would prefer cremation now could look at what we're doing and saying, you know what, that is a better way of communicating my faith to my kids, my grandkids, and my great-grandkids who might come to visit my grave, my loved ones, and learn again the power of prayer and the promise of the resurrection of the dead and the communion of saints.
It is pretty remarkable how you show in this book that, the cremation was taken up as a kind of like spiritual warfare by all of these different kind of like Luciferian revolutionary movements, from the French revolutionaries to the Masons to the Bolsheviks. And it's not a conspiracy theory type thing. It's all well documented. They stated their motives explicitly, and the popes of the time recognized that that's what was going on. So yeah, it's striking. It's hard not to kind of take a second look right at the practice when you see that its modern origins are such.
And I would add that going back to my conversion about 35 years ago, I had good friends who in the Milwaukee Archdiocese were all across the spectrum. But I also had some good, faithful, conservative, reactionary friends who were also conspiratorialists, who basically found a Mason under every stone. And where there's smoke, there's fire. I just wasn't sure how much there was. But I deliberately used Lacour's book, The Work of the Dead. He has no belief whatsoever, but he is an extraordinary historian. And so when he is sifting through the data, the evidence is so unanimous that it was the revolutionaries, it was the philosophes, it was the Freemasons, it was the Bolsheviks. There was a neo-Druidical revival in England and throughout the continent as well. And so the neo-paganism that launched this, well, at the time, a kind of new devangelization, was not only deliberately anti-Catholic, but wisely so. And their efforts at subverting the faith of a culture, I think, was more effective than I realized for most of my life as a Catholic adult.
Next, I'm going to play a couple of clips from episode 81, Love Like a Conflagration. That's the title of a poetry collection by Jane Greer. This was from my first interview with her on her return to the public eye as a poetry writer after decades away from it. And it's a really wonderful collection. I highly recommend checking that out. She's one of the best Catholic poets working today. So here's a bit with Jane Greer. What was the time span over which you wrote these poems? Were you kind of writing them ever since that first collection, or were they? Was there more kind of like a recent resumption of your poetic activities?
There was a very recent resumption, and I'll tell you the story, but I can't explain the story. Only God can do that. In the early 90s, my life was such that I just couldn't keep doing everything I was doing. And so one of the things that I could give up without, endangering my my family or my job or anything like that was Plains Poetry Journal. So that's why I quit publishing Plains Poetry Journal in 1993. But also, for some reason, I didn't write a poem. I didn't even think of a line for a poem or a rhythm for a poem for 30 years. I went about my life. I had a job I liked. I had a wonderful husband, and we had a child, and we were active in the community. And so I did all those things, and I had a really lovely life, but I didn't and I couldn't write a poem. And I mourned that more than once. I'd mourn it and then kind of say, all right, let go of it now. And then I'd see something or hear something, and I'd mourn it. I'd have to mourn it all over again. But I was pretty much reconciled to the fact that I just wasn't going to write poetry anymore. And then 2 years ago, almost to the day, my husband and I were visiting New Orleans. We're both North Dakotans, and so New Orleans is the most foreign place in this country, especially if you're from North Dakota. And we love New Orleans, but I was sitting alone in a little cafe, and all of a sudden I had an overpowering urge to write a poem. I had 2 lines of the poem. I had the rhythm, and I hadn't felt that feeling for 30 years, but I knew exactly what it was. And I didn't have paper or pen, but that's okay because I always have composed on a typewriter or now a computer, just always have. And so I wrote a first draft of this poem on my phone, and I was off. I was writing poetry again. And so I'm not trying to assign blame to God or anything like that, but because there's no blame. Everything works out beautifully, but my poetry tap was turned off for 30 years, and then in that little cafe it got turned back on again. So most of these poems in the first section are within the last 2 years. A few of them are older.
Wow, that's really amazing. So you regretted that you weren't writing poems, but you weren't feeling the urge to write them either.
I call it grief because it was taken from me, or I didn't have it anymore. I had the urge to write poetry, but I did not have a poem issuing from me. I always write with a line that won't leave me alone, or often it's a meter that just won't leave me alone. And I wasn't receptive to either of those 2 things for the 30 years that I didn't write poetry. And I wanted to be, but I just couldn't make it happen.
Yeah, well, what's hard to explain about that is that you clearly are a poet, and you don't really stop being a poet. Somebody doesn't, I don't think, stop being a poet. You don't actually lose the gift. But that is, I can see why you would say you wouldn't be able to explain that, because it's very, very interesting. But clearly you had the gift then and you have it now. So
I look back over those, pretty much it's 3 decades. And I look back over that time, and I am full of regret, but I don't know of anything that I could have done differently. It just was what it was. And now I look at where I am, and I think, well, those 30 years are what got me here. So there was a plan somewhere, and here's where I am now.
Well, maybe there's nothing to regret. You were doing what you needed to do for your family, and it just wasn't the place you were in your life, So it sounds providential, because you don't feel, not that I know anything about writing poetry, but these poems don't feel rusty to me anyway.
I'm as surprised as anyone that this is happening again, and at how easily I was able to do it again. So it's all just a marvelous plan, and I'm just kind of I'm riding the river wherever this takes me. But I take it a lot more seriously than I did 30 years ago. I feel that now this is my job, and so I'm a lot more attentive when I feel a poem wanting to crawl out.
That's great. Well, I'm happy that you've resumed, and I'm sure I know many others who were familiar with your work back then as a poet and as a publisher are happy too, because you got some really great praise from a number of our Catholic poets, Samuel Hazo, Mike Aquilina, Tony Esselin, and James Matthew Wilson, Ryan Wilson, all these, but they all spoke so highly of it. So,
well, the back cover of my book with the blurbs on it, that's going on my headstone too.
That's great. Well, can we hear Because God Wanted It? This is from the second section of the first half.
Because God wanted it. I stood alone in my dark backyard to grieve uncountable wrongs that I had yet to receive. What had undone me? Simply that a friend wronged me in ways she claimed not to intend. Still, I was Moses, grinding that gold to dust beneath my righteous heel, my hurt robust and richly fed. I was a walking bruise, wandering old familiar avenues, so old and so familiar and so grim. My heart's metrics a loud discordant hymn. There in the cloudy dark I shunned the word. Breakers of pain were what I more preferred. Over and over driven to revisit our every utterance and each exquisite pause and riposte. My peak was blackest, yes, to the devil's thoughtful, hot caress, yes, to some fracture that might not be mended. I stoked my little hurt to hate most splendid, and in that fever found surpassing pleasure, too urgent to rebuke, too rich to measure. Downfall that very nearly felt devout. Then the clouds parted and the moon came out, large and unsparing, full in my livid face, substantiation of a saving grace. Raise a doxology to that brisk shake, that light whose suddenness knocked me awake, delivered me embroiled in sin's commission. I had not prayed, did not yet feel contrition, was not yet sorry, humbled, or ashamed. In the very act of straying, I was claimed. Because God wanted it, because God could, because God loves me with my speck of good, because the Holy Spirit over the bent world broods, I was redeemed impenitent.
Yeah, I love that poem. And I think it's the only predestination poem that I'm familiar with.
I've never thought of it in those terms. I'll have to ponder that. I said before that few of my poems are autobiographical, strictly autobiographical. This one is. I really experienced this just like this, and I didn't think of it in terms of, what did you call it?
Predestination?
Predestination, yeah. I thought of it as just overwhelming love that I did not deserve, and yet I felt, and yet it changed me in that moment on the inside, and I knew I was loved, and I knew I was over this really bad blackness that was taking over me, this darkness. I was past that now at this point.
The last episode you're going to hear from is episode 126, How Charlie Parker's Music Changed My Life. And this was kind of a jazz appreciation episode, which began with a personal story about my early exposure to him in my late teens and how it really changed my whole relationship with music. Now, unfortunately, most of this episode is not available for listening in the podcast feed because of some issues with using music in our normal podcast host. So you can use the link to go listen to it on the Catholic Culture website if you want to hear the full episode. And that includes some of the music that I played. So here you're just hearing my story about Charlie Parker without his music. But in the full episode on our website, you can hear some of his music and some other great jazz that I included in the full episode. All right. I hope you enjoyed this highlights episode, and I'll see you with my next new interview. I started really getting into music probably when I was in middle school, and I quickly ended up getting into, you might not expect it, but I ended up getting into heavy metal, a genre that I don't listen to very much anymore, but which I will say is a lot broader and more various than people might expect who aren't familiar with it. It's not all screaming. Some of it is more on the melodic side. Not a lot of it. I would say virtually none of it has actually held up to my mature listening many years later. But that's sort of where I started out. That was the music that I was passionate about as a teenager. Sort of started broadening my tastes out into progressive rock and quite a bit of non-mainstream, maybe unusually sophisticated rock music. But I will say that even though I was more interested in music as music than probably most people just listening to the radio are, there was still quite a bit of my approach to listening to music that was similar to the pop culture, which is that to a large extent, my enjoyment of music was based on the way that it stimulated my emotions. My ability to enjoy my own emotional response to a piece of music and kind of to even sometimes sort of go off in a reverie that didn't necessarily, in retrospect, have a great deal to do with the music itself, although it was triggered by it. So I would listen to music that certainly that I found musically interesting to some degree, but mainly music that would stimulate an emotional response. Often I was attracted to things that I would have described at the time, had sort of like an epic feel to them. Things that had somewhat of the feel of a movie score, for example. But one of the other big developments for me as a teenager was that as a musician, both playing by myself and with others, I quickly discovered a love for improvisation, for playing things off the cuff. And if I had an interest in pursuing music as a vocation, I would have said, and still say, that I wasn't really interested in being a concert pianist or playing music that was just completely written down, playing something somebody else had written. What I really wanted to do was improvise. And I was particularly interested in group improvisation. So towards the end of my time in high school, I think it was the summer after my junior year of high school, so I would have been, 17, I got hooked up with a music teacher who became a very, very huge influence on my life. And I've actually interviewed him on this podcast a few times. His name is Mark Christopher Brandt. You may well have listened to some of my discussions with him. He's an amazing pianist and composer and improviser with background as a jazz musician. So I started taking lessons with him, and I really wanted to learn to improvise. And the only sort of tradition of improvisation that I knew about, and the only sort of really living tradition of improvisation that exists in the West today, because classical music used to involve a lot of improvisation, but no longer did as of the late 19th and 20th century. It's something I'd like to talk about on another episode sometime. Actually, I should say, to be fair, there was also a long-standing tradition of improvisation among a certain school of organ players as well, But anyway, jazz seemed to be the best way to learn to improvise. Now, I didn't really have any interest in jazz as a style or as a genre at that time, or much interest anyway. I really was interested in studying it as a means to an end, simply as a way to study improvisation as such. So I got together with Mark, and he's a jazz musician. So I figured, well, if I'm studying with him, I may as well learn jazz. So pretty early on in my studies with him, Mark gave me some music to listen to. He was teaching me the blues form in jazz, and a good bit of what he was giving me to listen to was music by the great alto saxophonist and composer and improviser Charlie Parker, often referred to as Bird. That was a nickname of his. Mark gave me these Charlie Parker recordings and basically told me to listen to them over and over again and learn to sing along with the melodies and the improvised solos on the recordings as a way of training my ear and really internalizing this jazz style, this way of playing music. So I have to say, everything I'm going to say about listening to Charlie Parker changing my life, I also have to attribute to my teacher, Mark Christopher Brandt, because, some teachers will teach their students just, whatever they want to learn or whatever they think they need or are interested in, whether it's, the pop culture or something else. Mark, as a great musician himself, knows that, to be a great musician, you have to listen to great music, and you have to do so in a disciplined way, in a focused way, and hence things like singing along with the recordings to really learn them, not just sort of have them on, but to really focus them into your soul by way of your ear and your sort of musical imagination stimulated by singing. And that's just a great credit to him as a teacher, that he got me out of my comfort zone musically in that way and engaging more deeply than I had. So I owe him a great deal. I'm very thankful to him for that. So I would be at home or driving around. I'd just be listening to these several old Charlie Parker tracks from the 40s and early 50s, over and over again, singing along with the different solos by the different musicians in the band. And as I was doing this, I began to have a really different experience of music than I was used to. Because of the way that I was listening in a focused manner and really focused on the music. I had to be, because I was having to hear all the details to be able to sing along with the solos. So I was really listening, focused on the music itself suddenly, and not on my own emotional response to the music. And the fact is that I couldn't have focused on my own emotional response to the music because I didn't have almost any emotional response to the music. It's not only because it is, very complex and some might say cerebral music, although I wouldn't endorse every, sort of connotation of that term, but also because it was music that was just completely unfamiliar to me. I'm sure that it might have been more emotionally moving to someone at the time who had an ear developed enough to enjoy it. But to me, it was just sound. I didn't dislike it, but it just didn't do anything for me emotionally like I was looking for in music. But because I was given this discipline by my teacher, and thanks be to God, I obeyed it and was listening to this stuff, I was just exposing myself to this music that forced me to engage in a different way. And so basically, as a result of that, my relationship with music became one of listening to music for the beauty of the sound and not for my subjective emotional response to it. Not focusing on my own feelings and sort of referring back to the music every once in a while, as many people do, and certainly as I did. So it really got me into this mode of, what I will later call disinterested contemplation of music. And obviously that whole idea has huge implications for relationship with any art form, relationship with reality, with the spiritual life, with prayer, things that I won't even try to get into in depth here. But it was really, in terms of my relationship with music, it was a profound change. And what it did for me is it opened up this whole world of music that I would never have really given that much of a chance otherwise. Basically, this whole world of jazz and classical music and other forms of music that might not be as sophisticated, but even like just forms of rock music or good pop music that I wouldn't have given a chance because it didn't hit my exact specific emotional buttons, that I came to appreciate greatly, and ultimately probably much more than most of what I was listening to all the time in high school up to that point. So it was really precisely because the music of Charlie Parker and his associates was not in my wheelhouse. It was not to my taste, that it was able to change me and my relationship to music in this way. And it's a way of listening to music that is totally foreign to most people today. And so I'm all the more grateful for that reason that I was given that opportunity. So I sort of won the golden ticket, as it were, into this world of contemplating music for its beauty as a play and sound. So, of course, as I play music for you in this episode and future episodes, I would urge you to try to approach it in that spirit as well, of sort of not trying to say like, what is this doing for me emotionally right now, and just focus on the music itself. I mean, what will happen eventually if it's beautiful music is that you will find yourself enjoying it to some extent, irrespective of your personal taste. We all have tastes. We all have things that move us more deeply, whether in an emotional or sort of a deeper spiritual way. But it will give you the ability to appreciate all kinds of music, even if it doesn't become your favorite. But then you'll also make some discoveries that will totally expand your love of music and deepen it. So like, I wasn't that into jazz as a style, but at first, but as I began to listen in this way, I began to appreciate jazz in its own right, not just as a means to an end for me to want to learn to improvise. I began to be like, yeah, I want to be an improviser generally, but I also want to be a great improviser in this style of music. Our tastes are not set in stone, and I think that we really sell ourselves short when we act like because something is out of our comfort zone or doesn't immediately push our buttons emotionally or however else, that it doesn't that it doesn't belong in our life. And I'll also say, on the other hand, that what I said about listening in a focused way on the sound will also prevent us from getting caught up in our heads, like intellectually, as in like trying to analyze it in a way that detracts from the actual experience of contemplating the beauty at hand. Or it will keep us from getting too in our heads about like, oh, I don't understand this. I have to get an intellectual foothold on this. Sometimes that can be helpful. Sometimes knowing some theory or explanations of the style can help, and I might give some of that as I discuss this music, but ultimately it's something that has to be experienced intuitively. And when we're focusing on either our emotions or on our thoughts as we listen to something, then we're no longer focusing on the music itself. We are listening to our thoughts rather than to the music. So aside from his importance in jazz and the importance that he came to have for me as I studied jazz music further and further, that is why Charlie Parker has such a fundamental importance in my own musical history.